So I always see when people are traveling overseas that they decide to go retro game hunting. Whether they're traveling across Europe, America, or Japan, mostly Japan. It seems like the thing to do. Well, I'm not going to any of those places anytime soon, so I thought, why can't I do it at home? Now, I live in Brisbane, which is the capital of Queensland in Australia, so surely we have some shops here worth looking at, right? Well, today I decided to go looking. I broke my search down into 3 different categories, starting with op shops, or thrift shops, depending where you're from. Now, the first op shop I decided to go to was the Lifeline, specifically the Lifelines that have the vintage revival sections, because you can usually find some good stuff there. Now, I decided to go to this Lifeline because I have actually seen Game Boy stuff there before. I've actually bought stuff before. However, today all I could find was this one single Game Boy game. But they do have a bunch of other cool stuff too, like this vintage Batman action figures. They also had stacks of Pokemon cards in different packs as well. Then of course there was a bunch of Funko Pops, but they also had some old vintage lenses, some film cameras, and they had a little stack of games at the back there as well, including a bunch of Wii Fit games. Not to mention a super limited edition FIFA 2007. But that was all at the Lifeline, so on to the next store. Now this op shop here is an independent one in a massive warehouse. There's heaps of clothes, furniture, a wall full of DVDs, some vinyls, and a very small amount of games there. Of course, Wii Fit. But I did find they had GTA 5 on PS3 for the low price of $10. What a ripoff. Moving on. I went to another Lifeline, but I'm a little annoyed because there's nothing inside, and I drove half an hour for it. They had some cool shirts though. Now the second category of shops I wanted to look at was of course secondhand stores. So the first place I ended up going was Randall's Thrift Store, which is in a giant warehouse. There's a whole bunch of cool stuff in there like furniture, knickknacks, garage stuff, clothing, and I found a couple crates full of vinyls with a little bit of Sinatra in there. Then a bookshelf full of DVDs and some CDs, and a suitcase packed full of DVDs, and you best believe it was hard to leave Sex and the City behind. No games though, so moving on to the second spot, Empire Revival. This is in a giant warehouse as well, which I feel like used to be an old swimming pool or something. I don't know, the roof just gives swimming pool vibes. But it's a bunch of individual shops all operating under the one roof, and it's honestly one of my favorite vintage shops to go to. They have so much cool stuff in here, you can honestly spend hours. But I found a bookshelf full of old cameras and some vinyls there as well, although I don't know if you want to buy Cosby vinyl. But then I found some cool Snoopy trinkets too. I actually kind of wish I got one. And this is in a different section of the shop, but I found a whole lot more old cameras. But then I felt like I started getting a bit warmer and I started finding some cool Pokemon plushies and some box action figures as well. There was an Ash Ketchum there, there's some old Star Wars stuff too. Actually quite a lot of Star Wars stuff there as well. And then I found another section full of old vinyls too. And then tucked away in the corner was some vintage Kiss action figures. RIP Ace Frehley. These things are probably going to go up in price. But again, no games. So moving on to the third spot, cash converters. Now I didn't film in here because I feel like a criminal every time I go in there. So here's a couple photos, here's some highlights. A couple cheap DS games, nothing worth mentioning whatsoever. A stack of Wii games as well. Looks like they're charging $49 for Wii Sports Resort. The Wiis themselves vary from $90 to $100, which seems kind of alright these days, I guess. With a Sega Mega Drive in the back there for $100. And a PS1 for $100, which actually looks in pretty decent condition. And of course, Wii Fit with the board this time. Impressive. However, nothing to my liking, so moving on to the third category, retro game shops. The ones specific for this type of thing. Now look, I know what you're thinking, why would I not just go there first? Well, these shops are really good and usually pretty stocked, however, they cost a lot. I understand they have to because they have to keep up with market pricing these days, but you're probably better off if you want to try and find something, going to sites like Sendico or Macari, or honestly, Facebook Marketplace is probably your best bet. However, if you want to get something today, these places are really good to look at. Plus, they're just a lot of fun to go through. So the first shop I went to was Game Traders, which I'd never actually heard of before, but I looked at Google and they had some good stuff on there. However, it was a little lighter when I was actually in store. They've got a few Game Boy games, DS games, and some PS1 games. However, I was caught off guard by the Monster Hunter Nintendo 3DS for $550. Insane. And of course, you got your wall full of Funko Pops. However, I didn't actually get anything, so moving on to the next spot, of course, CEX. Now, CEX always have a lot of good stuff in there, and I'll be honest, their pricing can be all over the shop, but sometimes it's pretty good. I've gotten a lot of stuff from CEX before, and I'll be honest, the camera I'm filming on right now, I recently bought from CEX. Because they got a 5-year warranty, it's kind of really good. But game-wise, it tends to be a bit expensive. So they've got typically almost everything from Nintendo, cold PlayStations in there as well. And this is just the stuff that I saw in the window first. However, I did get really caught off guard by $175 for a 2DS, insane. And $200 for the PlayStation 2 Fat. They did have the new version of the Zelda Game & Watch for $90. And of course, a couple controllers, average pricing, not too bad. However, I didn't get anything this time. But moving on to the next stop, Eddie's Retro. Now, I apologize, I forgot to actually film something at the front of the store, so this photo's from Google. But this place was honestly really cool. I'd never heard of it before, but you could spend hours in this tiny little shop just searching through everything. Plus, they also had VCRs, cassettes, and vinyls too, which is awesome. They had a Game Boy Macro there for $90, which is pretty cool, but then they also had a Nintendo 2DS for $140. Is that really what they're worth these days? They had a wall full of PS1 games, and a couple tubs full of Nintendo 64 and Super Nintendo games. And behind the counter was full of Game Boy games, as well as a Game Boy Color for $190, which seems a bit steep. There was a Super Super Nintendo for $190, as well as an orange N64 for $550. Oh my god. It's pretty cool though. Then a PS1 Slim for $160 and another Super Nintendo. This place honestly was really cool. I had a chat to the guy that was working there. He seems really nice and it's just a very fun place to be in. You can spend hours looking around. I felt like every corner I turned, there was a whole bunch of more stuff to look at. There was a cabinet full of DS, 3DS, and PSP games too, plus a bunch more Super Nintendo games as well. They had a nice selection of Nintendo 64 games, including Super Smash Bros. For $119, which is okay. On the counter was a tub full of random Game Boy games, so I actually got a couple. I got F1 Race and I got the SpongeBob SquarePants movie. Those two were $25 together. And moving on to our last spot, Super Retro. Super Retro is like CEX, but just less other random stuff. It's very nice in there, although I actually have a little bit of beef because I applied to work at their Rabina store and they did not hire me. Very rude. All the games are pretty reasonably priced, unless it's a rare game, but plenty of old stuff in here. Pretty much any game for any Nintendo console ever made. I spent a little bit of time here looking at all the games, however there's just a lot to take in. Like the original Zelda Game Watch for $320, a Sega Mega Drive 2 for $150, and a Jungle Green N64, but it's NTSC for $390, which seems a bit high for a country that only uses PAL. However, they had some Mario and Kirby games for around $50 each, plus a boxed Game Boy printer with rolls for $220, which isn't too bad at all. And this random sumo fighter game for $350, which I've never heard of before. They must be Tyler fans too. And if you want a Wii Fit game, well, I think they got that covered. For the low price of $1 too, not bad. Then I actually spotted the Japanese version of Tetris. Now, I have no clue if this is a minuet version, but guess what? I bought it. So, let's find out together right now. Look, I thought that would be the case. However, no, it is. It is a minuet version. Cool. Well, there you go. Minuet version Tetris for $20. Not a bad deal. I feel like I should probably clarify, if you don't know what the minuet version of Tetris is, it just has a different soundtrack. That's the only difference. Otherwise, everything else is exactly the same, just a different song. As I was leaving, I walked past another CEX, which had Super Smash Bros. For $90, which actually is a pretty good deal. But that was all I found at the shops today. So we got our F1 Race, we got SpongeBob the movie on the Game Boy, obviously, and we got the minuet version of Tetris for $20. That's actually not bad, I think, but I'm pretty stoked with that. So, just goes to show that there is stuff out there locally. I feel like a lot of the time, it just depends on luck. So I've had times where I've gone to that first op shop and there's been plenty of Game Boy stuff. Today, there was just one. And same goes with retro stores as well. They have a lot of stuff. However, if you're willing to pay the extra price, it's there. But sometimes you have to wait for the stock to shuffle around too. Personally for me, I still feel like Sendico is a good spot to get stuff from. Ideally from Macari or the Yahoo auctions there. But honestly, Marketplace too. There's a lot of people that like to post stuff up and don't really know what it's worth, so they just post stuff to get rid of it. And let me be honest, I'll happily take it off their hands. Anyways, a bit of a different video for me today, so let me know what you thought of it. If you stuck around this long, awesome, thank you so much. Please like, subscribe, do all the things, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye!